Welcome to Velocity of Change, a Protocol Labs podcast where we explore frontier technologies with experts across a variety of domains. Our goal is to uncover unique insights by taking educated guesses about the future. I'm your host, Jonathan Schwartz, a founder and an investor with a background in engineering and finance. Our topic today is on quantum vulnerabilities in Bitcoin. The common talking points for quantum attacking Bitcoin is around effectively stealing private keys and funds directly from individual Bitcoin wallets. Our guest today, Bolton Bailey, has a bit of a different take. Bolton is the co-author of a few different papers that discuss a concept called quantum mining, which effectively allows owners of a quantum computer to take advantage of the Bitcoin consensus mechanism, attacking the chain itself rather than just individual wallets. The game theory around quantum mining is extremely interesting and something we dive pretty deep into in this episode. Join us as we discuss the effects of quantum attacking Bitcoin and some potential mitigation techniques. This one's really important. We hope you enjoy. Bolton, welcome to the show. Thanks for taking the time to chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John.
So to kick things off, there's a lot of back and forth about how close quantum computers are. It's kind of a contentious topic in terms of timing and risk. But from your perspective, why are these things important to discuss now in terms of quantum vulnerabilities in cryptography and specifically in Bitcoin?
Quantum computing and the idea of quantum computing has been around for decades. Engineers are currently working on building the sorts of quantum computers that could, potentially compromise some of our crypto systems. And, while those computers are, still in the design phase, they're not really here yet. I think it's still important to talk about these issues now, because really it's the future of how our sort of communication systems and maybe for cryptocurrency, our money system are going to play out, right? So I think that, if people are investing in Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency today, then they need to have some confidence really that the value of their investment is not going to go way down. And so risks that come about in the future can be risks to the present value of the investments that people are making today. And so I think for that reason, it's important to understand where this technology could go so that people sort of make informed decisions about what they're doing.
Okay, that's really, really helpful context and information. Should we be worried today? Like, do we have things that we should be doing now that we aren't, or do we still have time to wait?
So I think probably we should be concerned today because, the time that it takes to develop solutions to these problems is, a factor in how well the rollout of those solutions is going to go. And I think the more thought we put into this now, the more concern we have about it, the better we're going to be able to sort of weather the storm in the future. So I think for that reason, it is very important that we consider these questions now.
Are you saying that in a quantum world where the quantum computers become more powerful, is the entire chain at risk, or is it certain subsets? And we're obviously going to get into the weeds of how we can pull this off, but just at a high level, what's actually at stake?
Yeah, so that's an interesting and probably a complicated question. I think that even if there were a large scale attack on Bitcoin or some problem that caused some Bitcoin to be stolen or the chain to malfunction, as hopefully we'll discuss, I think there are probably still ways that we could recover from that sort of thing. I think that it would still probably be possible to do some sort of reset where we go back to an earlier state of the blockchain, and we find some way of making sure that the people who held Bitcoins at a certain time are at least partially compensated, and we can make sure that there's some sort of continuity between the ledger of Bitcoin, as it were, before the attack and after the attack. But I think it's still important to realize that if there's a loss of confidence in the system, that's the sort of thing that can lead to a large drawdown in the value, especially if part of the reason, the monetary system has the value that it has to do with that very confidence, right? I think, part of the collective delusion, as some people call it, of money is that it's something that we can trust that other people will be able to trust going into the future. And if there's something to sort of compromise that, it makes it a little bit harder to see why the currency that we have should have the value that it does. And so there could be, and so it could definitely hurt the value. And I think, even if we're going to say something conservative, like it would only be a small fraction of the value of Bitcoin that would be sort of destroyed in such an attack. Well, a small fraction of trillions of dollars is still quite a lot of money, and could still be quite a problem. And so that's definitely something I think we don't want to happen, or at least it's something that we want to be prepared for the eventuality of, just to, so that we can feel confident in knowing what the risks are and making informed decisions about them.
That's such an interesting framing too, because you're right. Like, if a quantum computer cracks one private key or a signature, or even some quantum computer is able to cause a small double spend, the echo effect of that type of thing is actually more of like a psychological attack on Bitcoin, where people just might leave because they're like, hey, this is now insecure. So the longer term effects of something like this is maybe not even about quantum, and it's more about like confidence in the system.
There are even some sort of fringe positions, but positions nonetheless, that perhaps a quantum computer of a certain scale or a certain size, maybe it can never be built just due to engineering concerns. And I think even notwithstanding that sort of concern, there's still the idea of the risk that it could go that far, right? So I think that even with a large amount of uncertainty about how bad an attack would be, or how possible an attack actually is, how feasible an attack is, it's still important to sort of consider that as part of sort of your understanding of the risk.
I'd love to hear from you at a high level, not getting into too much detail quite yet. What are the different sort of surface areas of Bitcoin that could be vulnerable to quantum attacks?
So the most widely discussed type of attack that Bitcoin could be subject to would be an attack originating from Shor's algorithm. So I guess just to provide a bit of background, right? The cryptography that Bitcoin is based on, in part, is the cryptography of signature algorithms, right? So to possess Bitcoin is to, in some sense, to be able to produce a signature that attests to the fact that you have that Bitcoin and that you can send that Bitcoin to someone else, right? So if you hold the private key or the secret key for a particular Bitcoin, that's sort of what entitles you to the ownership of that Bitcoin. Now, the cryptography that underlies the cryptography of signature schemes, at least today, it has to do with elliptic curve cryptography, which is basically a type of math that operates over these numbers, and it tells you whether it's possible for you to create a signature for a particular Bitcoin. And so if you hold the private key for your Bitcoin, you should be able to create a signature for that Bitcoin. And the idea is that other people who don't know your private key, they can see your Bitcoin and they can see the public key, but they can't necessarily see the private key. And it should be basically a hard problem for them. They might try to use their computer to brute force a solution to try and figure out a valid way of spending that Bitcoin, but it should really take them long periods of time. It should take them universe lifetimes in order to be able to do that sort of attack. Now, the main sort of risk that people talk about has to do with quantum computers that people talk about is Shor's algorithm, which is basically a way that if you have a sufficiently large quantum computer that's sort of precise enough in its ability to correct its own errors, right? Its ability to sort of deal with the noise of heat in the system and things like this. So if you had a quantum computer that was powerful enough, you would actually have a way of computing that secret key, and you would be able to spend that Bitcoin. And so that, I would say, is the main risk, at least that people talk about. Quantum computing could affect the sort of consensus mechanisms behind Bitcoin. So another algorithm, not Shor's algorithm, but Grover's algorithm, is actually a sort of more general purpose way in which quantum computers can be used to solve computational problems. And there's a sort of idea that maybe this algorithm could be used in order to mine Bitcoin, right? So, in addition to sort of the signatures, the other sort of big part of the Bitcoin's cryptographic system is this sort of mining procedure, where computers all around the world they sort of race to compute these hashes. And if they have a hash that's sort of sufficiently nice, then that sort of is part of what entitles them to contribute transactions to the blockchain. And so there are miners all over the world that sort of gather transactions from people wanting to send their Bitcoin, and they sort of package them into these blocks, and then they run this mining procedure. And when they find a hash, then it becomes possible for them to contribute to the Bitcoin blockchain. And this part of this is part of the decentralization of the Bitcoin blockchain. It's one nice thing that people like about Bitcoin is that, in theory, anyone who has a computer that can compute these hashes is perfectly capable of joining the network and participating in building the blockchain, and they can even get some rewards for doing so in terms of new Bitcoin that's minted into the system, and they can also collect transaction fees. So I think people are often less concerned about the possibility of Grover's algorithm being a problem for Bitcoin. I think because, it's, for one thing, in order to have a computer mining Bitcoin with Grover's algorithm, it would actually have to be sort of a much more powerful quantum computer than even the type of quantum computer that would be capable of breaking a elliptic curve key with Shor's algorithm. So I think that it's sort of maybe farther in the future, the possibility of Grover's algorithm being used to mine Bitcoin. But I think something that people don't consider so much is that if a quantum computer ever does become capable of profitably mining Bitcoin, then that could actually sort of play a lot of havoc with the consensus mechanism, because that's something that was never really anticipated by Satoshi Nakamoto or the Bitcoin white paper, the possibility that there would be sort of a different kind of computer using this different kind of algorithm, Grover's algorithm, to mine Bitcoin instead of just sort of the vanilla classical way of mining Bitcoin by just checking hash after hash. And so I think that there's a lot that we could get into in terms of the ways that a quantum computer mining Bitcoin would change the incentives of a lot of the players involved, that would make the Bitcoin network less friendly to decentralization, and would also sort of encourage miners to sort of be more selfish, and it would give them sort of avenues to carry out larger scale attacks, perhaps. To summarize, those are the main two algorithms that could be potentially pose a danger to Bitcoin. We've got Shor's algorithm and we've got Grover's algorithm, and the risks are different, but I think both are worth considering.
One thing that would be quite helpful to just kind of set the stage here is, let's talk about and maybe I can even give a very high brief overview of the game that is Bitcoin mining, which is effectively a guessing game, right? So a bunch of computers compete to guess effectively a lucky number. And when you guess that lucky number, it's very quick for everyone else in the community to know and verify if you got that number right. And that number is also uniquely yours. And we don't have to go necessarily like too deep into how that works, but if you guess a lucky number and you text me about it, I can't do anything with your lucky number. If I do, I end up just like winning you the game effectively. So, and the interesting thing here, the difference, at least as far as I understand it, is breaking a private key or breaking a signature is it's actually a different problem. Breaking a signature because of elliptic curves is a cyclical problem. And so this is why Shor's algorithm becomes more relevant there. Whereas in this guessing game of Bitcoin, this is like what I think you've referred to, or some of your colleagues, or maybe the general community, as unstructured search. We're basically just looking for the right answer. And so I think one thing that is worth covering at the beginning is to get rid of the misconceptions about quantum computing and how a quantum computer, you don't really just have more powerful bits, right? Like qubits, and the way that we elegantly solve unstructured search problems is not from like measuring the output right away. And I'm going to be way less articulate talking about these topics than you will. So give us the common misconception of how quantum computers work, and then maybe correct that with a high level. I know this is really difficult to articulate, but using a high level description of Grover's algorithm, how it actually works at a lower level.
Yeah, sure. So to start with, I think there is a sort of very high level conception that I think people have, which maybe causes them to confuse the risk.
Which I did, to be fair.
It's important to note that a quantum computer is not something that can solve any computational problem just instantly, right? Shor's algorithm has to do with the very specific structure of the mathematical, the group theory that underlies those signature algorithms. And so really Shor's algorithm is one of the, I guess it's one of the only examples we know of something where that a quantum computer can really do things much faster than a classical computer. By which I mean sort of exponentially faster, right? Something that would take a classical computer, universe lifetimes to complete is something that a quantum computer could reasonably do. Maybe in, I think in the most recent estimates, is something that would be possible in maybe a week for a quantum computer, which is obviously a big difference. Now, I guess I should maybe caveat that it's also not totally for certain that we can't use some classical algorithm to attack this group theory. There's lots of unanswered questions in computational complexity theory. There are lots of hard problems about what computers can actually do, and so there's a lot of uncertainty there as well. But I think it's safe to say that Shor's algorithm is one place where is one of the key examples of a place where quantum computers can do much better than classical computers. Now, to get into Grover's algorithm, Grover's algorithm, as you said, it's an unstructured search algorithm, which basically means that it can tackle a wide generality of problems, right? Now, it's important to note that even though it can attack a wide generality of problems, that doesn't mean that it's attacking them sort of in this huge exponential advantage way that Shor's algorithm does, right? If a quantum computer is able to attack something like the Bitcoin mining problem, which is what we're interested in today, then it's not going to be able to necessarily do that very much faster than what a classical computer can do. Basically, the speed up for Grover's algorithm is what's called as a quadratic speed up. Basically, if it takes n computational steps for a classical computer to solve the problem, then we expect that for Grover's algorithm, it would take something like 3 to n steps. So not that much less, but certainly less computational steps for Grover's algorithm. But nevertheless, it is, even though it's not a very big speed up, it still is a speed up. And, it's still worth mentioning that, it's because it's something that can be applied to something like the Bitcoin mining problem. It's something that could potentially be used to mine Bitcoin profitably. And so, it's important to acknowledge at the one time that quantum computers are not sort of panaceas that can solve any problem instantly. But there are sort of a lot of ways that we can use quantum computers to speed up things, even if they're not making them sort of lightning fast.
That was a great overview. Could you talk about like what actually is the strategy if you have a quantum computer that has sufficient qubits and power? What are the different sort of approaches that you can take as a Bitcoin miner with a quantum computer? Let's first start in a world where there's maybe not even other quantum computers, just you're the only one. What options do you have available? In
the sort of Bitcoin difficulty problem, right? The difficulty or basically the number of hashes you need to complete in order to be able to successfully mine a Bitcoin block is something that depends on how many other people are around sort of contributing to the blockchain, because there's sort of this control mechanism that Bitcoin has to always try to space the blocks out in 10-minute intervals approximately. And so Bitcoin is constantly readjusting the difficulty of producing a block in order to sort of target that interval. And so, this has key implications for mining with Grover's algorithm, which is to say that if I'm running Grover's algorithm, and if I had to sort of compute, a full pre-image of a hash, if I had to do, 256 bits of reverse engineering of a hash with Grover's algorithm, that would definitely be something that would be not feasible. Because even though you have a quadratic speed up with Grover's algorithm, that's not really enough to get you all the way there. But because you only need to do, 80 or so bits of reverse engineering, that is something that makes it much more possible to use Grover's algorithm to approach. So let's maybe give an overview of how you might go about mining using Grover's algorithm in an environment where you're the only, let's say that I'm the only person with a quantum computer who's out there going to be mining Bitcoin with that quantum computer. How might I go about it? So I think the thing that I would do is I would start my computer on, running through Grover's algorithm to try to compute these hashes for these blocks, right? And so the first thing I would do would be I would have to consider how long I would actually be running Grover's algorithm for. Now, this is actually sort of an interesting question, and it's an interesting difference between how the quantum computer Grover's mining works and the classical computer works. Because with a classical computer, you simply run your computer for a given amount of time, and in every single interval of time, it has the same chance or probability of finding a correct hash. Now, what a quantum computer has is this sort of quadratic speedup, and that has this sort of really interesting effect where the longer amount of time that I spend running Grover's algorithm, actually each additional minute I spend gives me more of an advantage, right? So when I'm running a classical computer, each additional minute I spend gives me the same probability of successfully mining. But when I'm running Grover's algorithm, each additional minute I spend actually is more likely than in the last minute that I will now have something that works. Because basically of the way Grover's algorithm works, where things are sort of ramping up and ramping up. So at the one hand, I would really like to be doing long periods of time running my Grover's algorithm on a single block, just to be able to have, because, every additional minute I spend, my computer is essentially getting more and more effective, right? And I want to be continuing to do that. But on the other hand, there's a sort of limiting factor here, which is, of course, that everyone else in the network is continuing to mine blocks, and they mine blocks once every 10 minutes. And if somebody happens to come out with a block, or if multiple people come out with blocks one after the other, then if I'm not successfully mining in that time, I am not going to be able to sort of contribute anything to the blockchain, because, if I find a block successfully after 60 minutes, okay, that's very good for me, but probably the Bitcoin blockchain has already proceeded to mine 6 blocks in that time. And everyone will see that those 6 blocks, 6 is more than one. The Bitcoin network is sort of engineered to go for the more long chain of blocks. And so they will go for the long chain of blocks, and my block will be abandoned. And so I sort of have to make a critical decision about how long I'm going to spend doing this mining procedure before I do this, what's called this measurement operation, right? So a key part of Grover's algorithm, which I guess I should now discuss, is that another way that it's different from a classical mining procedure is that I don't get to know whether I've successfully mined a block until I do this procedure called measurement, where I sort of look inside the box and I check if I got something right. But it's sort of, well, it's this measurement procedure, and I can look inside and check. And if I look inside and check and I see that, if I stop early, the earlier I stop, the less likely it is that the check will be successful. And if I check and it's not successful, I basically don't get anything. I have to start from scratch. So it's really important for me to decide on the right amount of time that I should spend, mining and mining and mining until I check, because the longer I spend, the more likely it is that my check will result in a successful block. But also the more time I spend, the more likely it is that other blocks will have come in before me, and they will be sort of on the blockchain replacing whatever I would have put up there. So I could ask myself, what the math is on that. And luckily, there's actually a paper that examines this exact possibility. This paper on, I think it's called "On the Conditions for Advantageous Quantum Bitcoin Mining" by Naram and Gower. And there's actually a very funny sort of result in that paper, is that the amount of time I spend, it actually doesn't depend at all on how fast the clock speed of my quantum computer is or how many different quantum computers I have. It's always that I should mine after about 16 minutes. That's the optimal amount of time for me to run my Grover's algorithm before I check inside and see if I have something that I can publish. Because if I wait any longer, it's becoming more and more risky that my work is going to be undone by other people putting new blocks on the chain. And if I don't wait that long, then it's just it becomes less likely that I'm going to have a success at all, because I didn't spend much time, running Grover's algorithm, turning the crank in order to get that success. So it's really sort of funny that it sort of turns into this result of when I have this quantum computer that's doing this mining, I sort of want to mine for, approximately, it's exactly 16 minutes. Maybe it's a little bit less than 16 minutes, but it's this fixed period of time that I spend mining before I look inside my block and see if it's something that I can publish.
Why doesn't 16 minutes, that number, change when you have faster iteration speed? So like the clock time of a quantum computer is faster. Why then can that not go under 10 minutes?
So that's a great question. So if I have a computer that has twice the clock speed, well, if I was previously mining with a certain probability of success after 16 minutes, then I can now mine with that same probability of success after only 8 minutes, right? Because my clock is running twice as fast. So, you might ask yourself this question of, why don't I simply mine after 8 minutes if I have this new quantum computer? But the sort of counterpoint to that is, okay, if I run for 8 minutes, I can have a certain probability of success. But now I think, okay, what if I mine with this new computer at 16 minutes again? And the answer is, okay, if I mine with this new computer at a time of 16 minutes, I actually have 4 times the likelihood of successfully getting a block, right? So this is sort of where the quadratic speed up comes in, is because it's one of these sort of paradoxical things about having this, the longer you go, the more sort of power you have, right? You could mine at 8 minutes and you would be doing just as well as you were doing before. And you would even be a little bit more successful than before, because you would be getting in, if there was a block between 8 minutes and 16 minutes, you would be getting in before that block. And so you would be having more success in that way. But if you wait to 16 minutes, then there's a much more likely, 4 times more likely that the block will be successful. And so, there's only a relatively small chance that a block will come in those intervening 8 minutes to sort of interrupt your process. But the benefit you get from that sort of 4 times likelihood increase of successfully mining, that's something that sort of cancels out that factor, and it all sort of equilibrates. You could have a clock speed of 10 times the speed up. You could have a clock speed up of 100 times the speed up. But the sort of weird and paradoxical thing is that, it always happens to equilibrate just at 16 minutes. That always happens to be the right amount of time to spend.
That is so interesting and counterintuitive. I think I get what you're saying, because in basically, if you do the math, the quadratic increase of success outweighs quicker measurement. But if you graph that on a chart, doesn't it kind of plateau at some point where it's like, okay, I don't actually need any more probability of success, because now that time in between 8 and 16 minutes actually is like the bigger issue than how close I am to getting the lucky number. Because like at 99.9% success, like another 4x on top of that is like marginally better, even if that's like 2x the minutes that you have to wait. Something's not computing for me.
This is actually a very interesting point, because this is something that I was very confused about too when I was first learning about this. And I think this is also sort of a major sort of source of misunderstanding about Grover's algorithm. So you say, what if I have a 99% chance of success at mining a block? How is it possible to go 4 times up from 99% chance of success? That's a 300% chance of success. Well, you can't have more than 100% chance of success, right? So how is that possible? So the answer is yes, Grover's algorithm does plateau at 100% chance of success, but it's important to realize that when we're talking about successfully mining blocks with a quantum computer, the probability of success is almost certainly going to be very low, and that has to do with the sort of speed, the clock speed of the quantum computer, right? So, if you think about how fast the rest of the world is in processing its blocks, if you're just a single quantum computer and you have a 100% chance of successfully mining with just a single quantum computer after 16 minutes, that would mean that your quantum computer is running about as fast, modulo this sort of quadratic factor, as the entire rest of the entire world, all of the, Bitcoin hardware, application-specific integrated circuits, all of those in existence. That would be what you are competing against. So I think it's an important intuition to have, that no matter how fast your quantum computer is, you should expect that an individual quantum computer is individually going to have a very low probability of doing the successful mining procedure. Just as I should say that an individual Bitcoin chip, or an individual Bitcoin ASIC, or an individual core on an individual Bitcoin ASIC, each one of those has a minuscule probability of successfully mining a block at any one time. What you should really be thinking about is, okay, if I'm seriously going to be carrying out this sort of mining operation using Grover's algorithm, I should think that I actually have a bunch of quantum computers running in parallel, right? And this maybe gets into the question of how long is it going to take to actually realize the system like this. I think it's something that probably is going to have to wait for quantum computers to come more into mass production and the ability to carry out many quantum operations in parallel all at once. So there's going to be valid questions about how far away that is. But it's still something that you should think of as, okay, I have this individual quantum computer, maybe I should think of the individual quantum computers as only having, a 1 in a million chance or a 1 in a billion chance of successfully mining. And so that's what I'm multiplying by 4 every time I double the amount of cycles that I have. And so this is why I should think that, okay, my probability is always going up by a factor of 4 every time I double, because it's just so infeasible that I would actually be close with just a single quantum core to getting 100%.
There's something about a discrepancy between classical computing and quantum computing that if quantum computing took off and it became much cheaper, and I read over that paper as well in terms of, I thought that it was really helpful to talk about full cycle time in quantum computing, right? So you have to also consider, after you've done one round of the game, when you measure and then when you reset, how long does that take? And that also becomes part of this game as well. And so, I don't know, there's some world in which all the pieces align. Bitcoin is still running a mostly classical computing game, which is still getting faster. But it's, I think I see what you're saying though. You have to.
Maybe I'll give you some more intuition, right?
Please.
Really, I think if you think about just a classical computer, right? Think about what it would take to have a classical computer which runs at gigahertz clock speed, what would it take to add like 9 more orders of magnitude onto the clock speed of a single classical computer, right? Well, at this point, it's not really an engineering problem; it's a physics problem, right? There's no physical material that you can actually make to do that. That's not going to melt instantly the second you turn it on, right? And so that's sort of the problem here. Part of the problem is that Grover's algorithm doesn't
touches the laws of physics.
Yeah. This is like you can run Grover's algorithm on a single quantum computer, but having multiple quantum cores doesn't really make it possible to run Grover's algorithm n times faster. All you can really do is run n. If I have n different quantum computers, it's not possible to run Grover's algorithm at n times the clock speed. All that's really possible is to run n different instances of Grover's algorithm at that same clock speed, which is important because of this quadratic difference, right? If I could run a single instance of Grover algorithm at n times the clock speed, I would be getting an n squared speed up. Whereas if I'm parallelizing,
it's linear. Yeah. You're just getting like a coefficient. You're not benefiting from Grover's algorithm. You're just running more Grover's algorithms. Yeah. Okay. That's helpful. I see what you're saying. So we're touching the laws of physics effectively, and maybe we'll find an even more exponential version of Grover's algorithm one day, and then this may change. I don't know. Is that possible?
Well, I should say, I think there are sort of theoretical limitations. People have, complexity theorists have determined that Grover's algorithm only, like, there's nothing, you can't necessarily do that much better than Grover's. If we're talking about unstructured search, which is the type of problem that Grover's algorithm solves, there are sort of theoretical reasons why quadratic is the best you can do. And so there are different sort of versions of the problem. There's sort of like birthday time, there's different versions that have different exponents, but like this quadratic exponent sort of seems to be a limit. So I guess this is all to say that, there's a variety of complicated reasons which make Grover's algorithm likely to be the limit. But yeah, I guess you never know. We could discover something totally is a game changer in terms of like the structure of the hidden structure of the hash algorithm. That seems unlikely, but maybe there's some weird thing that totally blows our minds that will come along.
Right. Okay, so but the conclusion here is like it's always going to be optimal to check a measure at 16 minutes. And so what's the conclusion from that?
I mean, so one sort of important and interesting thing is that you can detect. It gives you a good way of detecting if somebody is out there mining, doing Grover mining, because you sort of see that all the blocks are coming 16 minutes after the last. What's this?
But would that be a chain of only Grover miners, or like if you see the same miner ID always coming in with a 16-minute block when there's an opportunity to do so, that miner is probably a quantum miner?
Right. Well, I think what the best way of detecting it would be sort of like, do a sort of statistical plot, right? Do a plot. Okay, how many blocks are there from 1 minute to 2 minute? How many blocks are there from 2 minute to 3 minute? You sort of make some bins, and you see that there's sort of this anomaly exactly at 16 minutes. And that would be sort of a way of like, okay, something strange is going on here.
Yeah, like a heat map.
So that would be the practical consequence in terms of detecting it. But I think, to answer your question more seriously, I think so maybe this would be a good time to get into what would be the consequences in terms of what does this mean for consensus, right? What does this mean for the design of sort of Nakamoto consensus, and how would it sort of change motivations? Because that's actually a much more serious question.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
So I think so I've said that miners are mining after 16 minutes, and that would be how a quantum miner would go about mining on the blockchain. Now, and I've sort of further mentioned that if the main obstacle to going longer is that somebody else is probably going to come along and mine a block of their own, and that is going to sort of displace my current block. So that is the main thing that a quantum miner is afraid of, is someone coming along and mining a block instead of them, which invalidates all of their work, right? So I think the question that we have to ask ourselves now is, okay, so if a quantum miner is going to mine for 16 minutes, as you said, it's fairly likely that in those intervening 16 minutes, a block is going to come along anyway, right? I think 16 minutes, I think probably about half of blocks, just based on the sort of the sort of exponential or the Poisson distribution at which Bitcoin blocks come. Probably a lot of blocks are going to come before those 16 minutes.
I thought it said 20% of blocks occur after 16 minutes, but I could be misremembering.
Yeah. So I think, that would sound about right. I think the rule is that, about 70%. So after about 7 minutes, I think it should be about half of blocks come in that period of time, and probably another half of blocks come in. So 20% sounds about right, if I'm doing the math in my head. So the question is, if I'm a quantum miner and I see a block that comes along in those 16 minutes, what am I supposed to do with the block that I am already mining, right? Now, if I were a classical miner, it would be a simple question. I don't have anything on my computer that I just switched to the new block, right? There's no reason for me to continue mining the old block because the new block is the newest game in town. But if I'm a quantum miner, then I've already invested, 5, 10, 15 minutes into mining the block that I'm mining currently. The question is, am I just going to throw that work out?
Definitely not.
Especially because, there's actually not much of a reason to, right? What I can do is when I see a block come along in those first 16 minutes, I can just immediately measure my block just on the chance that maybe I'll get lucky, right? It's if I have some probability of successfully mining after 16 minutes, well, if I mine that after 8, if a block comes along in 8 minutes and I mine after 8 minutes, well, that's still it's not as likely as mining the full 16 minutes, but it's still about a quarter as likely that I'll successfully be able to mine the block as soon as I see that classical block from the rest of the network come in. And so you get this situation where if miners do decide that the right thing to do when a block comes in over the network is to immediately measure what they have currently just on the off chance that it'll be successful, a significant portion of the blocks that miner mines will actually be blocks that they mine sort of in competition with the rest of the network. And so the unfortunate thing that this leads to is this sort of phenomenon of lots of sibling blocks, right? Where there's 2 blocks that have been mined at the same height because this quantum miner has produced a block, and it's a significant fraction of all of the blocks that this quantum miner mines are actually going to be sort of competing on the network with these classical blocks. And so this leads to a number of unfortunate incentives, I would say, for quantum miners. The first is that they have an incentive to make deals with other miners to include those blocks, right? So you could ask the question today, why isn't Bitcoin mining more centralized, right? Especially in light of this sort of concept. This concept dates back to around 2013 with the concept of selfish mining, which is actually identified as a problem in classical Bitcoin mining too, right? If I have a block that can compete with another person's block, there's a question of, maybe if I can get a large enough coalition of friends together in the Bitcoin network, I can get people to start accepting my block. Even though more often than not, the longest chain will win out, maybe I can sort of, gain an advantage where a larger proportion of the blocks are my blocks. Because, when 2 blocks come out at the same level, I have people working with me to work on my block. So if we have a quantum miner like this, now the issue is that this problem becomes thousands of times more incentivizing towards the proposition of trying to do this selfish mining than it was for classical mining. Because if I'm a classical miner, well, it's very unlikely that I'm going to mine a block at the same time as another person's block. I think it's only like once a month or so that this even happens in the Bitcoin network, that 2 separate miners mine so simultaneously that both blocks go out on the network. But with a quantum miner, because they're measuring every time they see a block come in the first 16 minutes, well, tons of their blocks are going to be these sort of uncle blocks. And so they're going to have a lot of incentive to try and find ways of making their block be accepted, right? One way that they could make their block more likely to be accepted is to buy more mining equipment, right? So like if I'm a miner, right, I can mine on my own blocks if I want to. So if we get a situation where if I'm a larger quantum Bitcoin miner, the larger I become, the more effective all of my other sort of equipment gets, because I have the opportunity to, mine my own blocks, all of these sort of sibling blocks that I'm producing. And we get a sort of situation where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And I think that is sort of the most dangerous thing about this, this line of thinking, because that is sort of somewhat antithetical to the Bitcoin spirit, I would say. Because, I think a really great part of the Bitcoin consensus mechanism as it exists already is that it's basically fair, right? The amount of rewards you receive are in proportion to the amount of mining equipment you run. And so anyone can sort of join and be just as profitable in terms of, profit, the ratio of their profit to the ratio of their expenditures as anyone else on the network. But that's something that is potentially compromised by this scenario where Bitcoin is mined quantumly. And the worry that I would have is it would lead to sort of centralization, right? There would be this tendency for, miners to merge and, become more and more sort of larger groups until there's only a few different miners on the entire network. And that sort of compromises the validity of Bitcoin as a decentralized, cryptocurrency.
Okay, so much to cover there. First, I just want to cover the game theory of measuring when you hear about another block. So that, because I think that's a critical part of this, is really unobvious, right? Which is that, like, if I'm a quantum miner, I'm playing the guessing game, but I can't see if I got it right until I measure. Now, if I hear of someone else winning a block, what's the natural sort of game theoretically rational thing for me to do? Well, it's to check really quick. Did I also win? Because at this point, I'm just going to waste that work and then I'm going to start over again. So I might as well check. Now, today, with only classical miners on Bitcoin, very, very rare that two miners win the guessing game at the same time and produce two blocks. Even more rare that it continues, right? So like eventually, like, one chain wins out. But in this world of quantum miners, when I measure the probability of two sibling blocks, what you're saying, two blocks that come out at the same time that are both valid, like this probability increases, and quantum miners can actually use that to their advantage in certain scenarios. You've mentioned that I can effectively collude with other miners in the network so that we all support each other's blocks. And so then we just get an advantage because every time there's a sibling, we're going to win. But is there also a way to propagate like forks on Bitcoin until you can double spend and then fix it in a way that's kind of like sneaky? Like, is that an attack vector? How would you execute a double spend with a sibling style attack?
Yeah, sure. So what we've been discussing so far, you could call it an attack maybe in that you're doing this measuring, but in some sense it's not an attack at all, right? It's just the miners following their own incentives.
It's a front running.
But there's something, this sort of procedure of mining selfishly and so the question is, can this scenario lead to sort of long forks, right? Where I'm sort of mining on my own and I'm mining my own sort of chain, and I sort of assume complete control of the blockchain. And the answer is that, it doesn't, that on its own doesn't really lead to a complete fork of the blockchain. Because, if I am just following this procedure of mining and measuring when I see another block, I'm only really producing one block at a time. So I guess there's a question, and, this gets into, a further attack that, which comes from work that I did with my colleague Or Satath. Or Satath, by the way, is I think maybe the first person to articulate the scenario we've been talking about just now of these individual quantum miners doing this sort of selfish activity. There's a question of, okay, if I'm a quantum miner, can I actually do something that's even more sort of malicious and evil? And can I, instead of just, mining these blocks one off when I see other blocks coming in from the blockchain, can I actually, extend my power and leverage the fact that I have this sort of quadratic speed up in order to like carry out a larger scale attack? And so this is an interesting question. And spoiler alert, the answer is sort of yes, unfortunately. So here's actually what a quantum miner can do. It involves a little bit more sort of manipulation and going down into the low level details of how something like Bitcoin works, right? So if I'm mining a single block, right, and I'm sort of doing that in a way that's cooperating with the rest of the Bitcoin network, then the difficulty level of the block that I'm mining is determined by the rest of the network, right? The rest of the network has a certain speed at which they operate, and I am mining blocks that are at a difficulty that's consonant with that speed. So if I'm willing to sort of go sort of more to the dark side, and I'm willing to try and manipulate those factors, there's a question of whether I can actually sort of manipulate more factors to do with the difficulty in order to give myself more of an advantage. Now, okay, so I mean, the first question that you might ask is, okay, well, is that possible with a classical computer? And with a classical computer, it's not possible for the simple reason that, if you sort of try to manipulate the difficulty of a block, try to make a block more or less difficult, then it doesn't really affect, as a classical miner, the sort of inherent power you have. Because the way that Bitcoin works, I think I mentioned earlier that Bitcoin sort of works on this longest chain principle. It's sometimes called the longest chain principle, where the longest chain of blocks is the chain that is decided upon by the network as a whole. But that is actually it's actually a bit of more nuance there. The actual way that Bitcoin decides what the right chain to choose is not necessarily the longest number of blocks in a chain, but the strongest chain. It's the most total difficulty, right? Because if I were to decide on the basis of something other than the total difficulty, then I could just, choose, if I were to just, count the blocks rather than counting the total difficulty that made up the blocks, there would be a potential for an attack where I could, make a bunch of blocks at a very low difficulty, and I could, mine a bunch of blocks that way, and I would have a better chain than the rest of the network. And that would certainly be not the way to go, right? So the way that Bitcoin works is the chain that is chosen is chosen to be the chain that has the most difficulty behind it, right? And so there's a question, okay, that's fine for classical computers, but with quantum computers, is there a way that I can somehow manipulate that to my advantage? And it turns out that, there's a few things that have to happen, but this is how such a manipulation could be done, right? The first thing is, going back to Grover's algorithm, a quantum computer has more of an advantage the longer it goes, the more sort of difficulty it has to expend, because the more difficult the problem it's working on is, where a classical miner would only be able to carry out n operations towards that goal, the Grover miner, the quantum miner, sort of has this quadratic advantage where the more difficult it is, it can get 4 times as difficult for a quantum miner. But when it's 4 times as difficult for a quantum miner, that only means it's twice as difficult because of this quadratic speedup. And so there's this weird effect where a quantum miner, in terms of the power that it has, it actually wants things to be sort of more difficult, and it wants to actually increase the difficulty of all of these blocks. Because when the difficulty has been increased, the miner can then say, okay, I'm solving these blocks at this difficulty, and I'm producing more work. Basically, if I quadruple the difficulty, then I am only doubling the work that I have to do. But because I'm quadrupling the difficulty and doubling the work, I'm sort of adding work at a rate that's twice as fast, right? 4 divided by 2. I'm basically doubling my effective power every time I do that. And so what the quantum, sort of a more malicious version of a quantum miner could hypothetically do, because I think there's some important caveats to this attack that I want to get into later. But what they could hypothetically do is they could just keep doubling and doubling the difficulty. Now, there's an important thing to add, which is how is it possible for a miner on their own to change the difficulty? The answer is the difficulty is sort of determined by the timestamps of the blocks, right? The way that the regular Bitcoin network knows to change the difficulty is if the blocks are coming too fast, they all have all the blocks have sort of timestamp on them that tells the network at what time they were
That's very
created.
elegant.
If the blocks are coming too fast, yeah, the Bitcoin network will come and change the difficulty for that reason. So that sort of gives the quantum attacker sort of backdoor into manipulating the difficulty. It can pretend that the blocks are coming faster than they actually are by lying about the timestamps. And that sort of, causes it to explode in difficulty. And the blocks keep getting more and more difficult, but the miner now has more of its own power to mine these blocks. And the quantum miner can, in principle, get to a point where they have more power than the rest of the network combined. If they sort of just they just keep on doubling things until they have lots and lots of power behind the network.
There was definitely a talk of double spend attacks in basically quantum miners. The attack that you just talked about seems more like a power domination attack. I get to own basically a very large portion of blocks on the network. Is there a way to execute a double spend? Like that breaks consensus in some way, no?
Right. So let me first address how this could be used to carry out a double spend, right? So so basically I've described how I can accumulate all of this effective power as a quantum miner. So how can I use that to double spend? Well, the way so how what has to happen in the normal Bitcoin network in order for a coin to be considered spent? Well, number one, it has to go on the blockchain. And then typically it has to sort of spend some time on the blockchain. But it sort of has to be buried deep. I think sometimes it's said that a block has to be buried 6 blocks deep in the longest blockchain in order for a Bitcoin to really be considered spent. And the reason for this is that, even on a short-term level, just due to sort of random fluctuations in people, mining blocks at the same time, it could be the case that one chain, there's a fork of the chain, and hypothetically, they could sort of race against each other until one chain sort of becomes much longer. And so what's typically said, I think, is that, a Bitcoin transaction, in order to feel really secure about it being confirmed and spent on the blockchain, it has to not only be included in a block, but that block has to have, 6 further, blocks worth of work done on top of it in order to sort of confirm it. So how could we sort of subvert this, right? Now, if a block is considered spent, the question is, how can I do a sort of fork of the blockchain to re-spend that Bitcoin or consider spending it to another account, right? So the way that I would do that is I could spend my Bitcoin on the normal chain, and then I could do this attack I was talking about, where I was boosting the power of my quantum computer. But I would start that attack starting at a block that happened much earlier, right? I could go back in time to before I had spent the Bitcoin that I wanted to spend, and I could start my attack at that block. I could fork off at that point in time. And because I can accumulate all this power, I can now shoot that new blockchain forward to the point where it's above and beyond the normal rest of the network. And basically the point at that point is that the Bitcoin fork choice rule says that if I have a sufficiently powerful new chain, then that has to be the chain that new blocks consider. Now, I think there's some important caveats to this, which is that if there's been a lot of blocks on the network, if there's a lot of nodes already on the network and they've already been working on the basis of one chain, it is going to be sort of incredibly suspicious that there's this new chain of blocks coming in that claims to be totally separate from the 10 or 100 or 1,000 blocks that we've already seen, and yet it's supposed to be more powerful
with really compressed timestamps too.
Yeah. So I think there's a few things that would have to really line up for you to do this double spend attack, which is you would have to have some target that was not savvy to this possibility. I think it's not totally obvious what companies that send and receive Bitcoin use as their security practices. I'm sure that they have their own security practices that prevent this sort of thing. So you would have to find some sort of victim that was not savvy to the possibility of this new chain coming along that you could attack, that was maybe just joining the network at the time you completed your attack. That would take this. So definitely like good to provide caveats here that it would be very hard to sort of carry out this attack in a way that, people would traditionally associate with stealing Bitcoin from one person to another, and doing this. Now, I think, maybe there's a good point to be made that, so this is work that I did, as I mentioned before, with my colleague Orsatat. And one thing that we've talked about is, maybe the most effective way of, profiting from this sort of malicious attack is not to do double spending at all, but to use this attack, going back to the things that we were talking about at the very beginning, to use it sort of as an attack on the confidence of the Bitcoin network, right? So, if I can do this sort of double spend attack, one thing it does is, most people will notice it. But once people do notice it, there might be some sort of chaos that sort of happens with regard to, okay, how do we decide what the new chain is? Do we have to change our security mechanism? Do we have to fundamentally hard fork Bitcoin? There would sort of be a lot of chaos. And maybe one way that you could think about going about this attack is not as a double spend attack, but I could use some sort of financial trickery to maybe short Bitcoin in the period before I carry out this attack, just on the assumption that the attack that I'm going to do is going to really decrease the confidence in Bitcoin, and maybe lower the price. So that might actually be the most effective way to take advantage of this attack, not really as a way of targeting any one individual thing, but sort of targeting the confidence in the network as a whole.
I see what you're saying. Much harder to pull off. I guess if you have like an exchange that you find that waits 2 block confirmations that is going to allow you to off-ramp your Bitcoin really quickly through some optimistic means or whatever, then you could get into trouble, presumably in a way that's a little more realistic. 6 blocks probably harder and a lot more sus, but it's good to still be aware of the types of attack. So do you feel good about moving into like this tie-breaking mechanism space, or do you any more like hack executions or attack executions you want to cover before we go into potential defense against the dark arts?
Well, yeah, I think let's get into defense against the dark arts, because I think there's probably a few ways that you could think to sort of mitigate this kind of attack. So one thing that I think you're alluding to is sort of a proposal that Or put forward about trying to sort of validate that particular blocks are being mined in the manner that they are supposedly being mined, right? So one way that you could sort of try to mitigate the concept of Grover miners entirely is you could try and force one simple thing you could do is you could force miners to include in the information that they are mining about they would have to include what the current time is at all time, not just the timestamp of the previous block, but the timestamp of the current block. And so this is something that's already I guess it's sort of already done, right? Because Bitcoin blocks include their timestamp. But the important thing to realize is that if you're doing this sort of this Grover miner procedure, right? Well, if you're doing this sort of 16-minute thing, then you know the timestamp in the future of when you're going to be mining this block. But if you're going to be mining the block sometime between 0 and 16 minutes, then you aren't going to be certain of the timestamp of the block that you're publishing. And so it would be very hard as a quantum miner to basically publish a Bitcoin block early or before you were intending to publish it, and have it still be and have it have a timestamp that was consistent with the time that you put it out on the network. And so this would be maybe a useful way of establishing whether a particular block is suspicious or not, right? A block might be very suspicious if somebody is saying that it was mined exactly 16 minutes after the the previous block, and yet it seems to have come early, right? People have a timestamp that's 8 minutes into the future, and yet they're publishing the block now. Sort of suggests that something weird is going on. And I think that basically the idea is that if there is this sort of suspicion about a block, we could maybe do some things in terms of how the network would handle those blocks. Maybe the point is that we would deprioritize those blocks when there's a tie, right? If there's a tie between two blocks, we could, check to see if the timestamp that we got one block is consistent with the time it was supposed to be mined. And if that was the case, then we could proceed with mining that block in order to sort of discourage people from carrying out these sort of these attacks where you mine on top of another block. Now, like to give maybe a counterpoint to that argument, right? It sort of gets into the question of, okay, well, we can ask miners to do this sort of deprioritization, but is that really in the miners' best interests? Do we have are we sure that that is basically an incentive that is aligned with their incentives as miners in order to do that? Because if the algorithm is telling you to deprioritize one block, but then that block actually gets more blocks on top of it, and it becomes the main chain, then then the other miners might sort of be nervous that they don't want to be mining on the block that's not going to be a part of the main chain, because that means they don't get their reward. And so there's sort of questions and game theory about what's the best way of doing that. Certainly, it seems like it would help some, because it would give you at least one avenue for determining whether a block might be suspicious, and determining whether a block is a particular way that we could maybe avoid a particular block. But on the other hand, it sort of makes things a little bit more complicated.
Right. So effectively, in the aggressive style quantum mining attack, where I hear of a block and then I go and measure, it's very difficult for me to actually know what time that happened at. And so generally that block would be propagated to the network with like the 16-minute timestamp. And so you can use that mismatch to effectively sniff out something that looks suspicious and act on it in a way that's more aligned with the network's incentives. There's maybe reasons that it doesn't make sense, but ultimately that's like a hook that you could potentially design something to help align incentives here. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and not to say that it's totally unworkable, because I think that I think you can make a good case that all the Bitcoin miners do sort of have a fundamental incentive to keep Bitcoin working well, right? Because as people have rightly pointed out, one of the nice things about Bitcoin and its incentive system is that if you're a miner, then you have a stake in the Bitcoin ecosystem. Effectively, you probably own Bitcoins. You have mining equipment that can be used to get more Bitcoins. You sort of want to, I think, as the Bitcoin white paper puts it, you don't want to undermine the legitimacy of the system, and so you do have some inherent incentive to sort of keep things running smoothly. And so that could be a good way of sort of doing that. If you sort of establish good rules for trying to keep things kosher, then that would be a good way of moving forward.
Got it. Are there other solutions to the Grover style attacks that you feel optimistic about?
Maybe a clear solution is the following, right? So currently, I think that Bitcoin uses sort of two iterations of the SHA-256 hash algorithm as its fundamental hashing function, right? And Grover's algorithm, it requires you to sort of run this hashing algorithm a number of times. But to go back to the paper that talks about the conditions for advantageous Bitcoin mining, the paper that sort of articulates this 16-minute number, it also has a great section about how fast your quantum computer would actually need to be in order to be profitable. And the answer is something like, okay, the cost of running a hash on a quantum computer, like the ratio of the cost of running a hash for a quantum computer versus a classical computer has to be somewhere on the order of the ratio of time it takes to run a single hash with respect to the 10-minute block time, right? So one way that you could just make quantum computers less effective in general is to sort of choose a more complicated hash function, right? Maybe a hash function that did 1,000 iterations of the SHA-256 mining algorithm. I think that would be maybe the most sort of straightforward way to just sort of very quickly put a damper on the effectiveness of a particular quantum computer. Now, to add a caveat to this again, it would probably also put a damper on a lot of the existing mining equipment that's sort of already been established and is in the hands of Bitcoin miners. So I think, Bitcoin miners probably would have something to say about that if their mining equipment suddenly became much less useful on the basis of changing the hash algorithm. But that's just to say that is at least a hypothetical way that you could not change the design of the system too much and still have something that was sort of much harder for quantum computers to attack. To add another caveat to the question of this sort of malicious attack of forming this very strong chain, it's worth saying that while it's in principle an attack that you can carry out with any size of quantum computer, as the quantum computer you have gets less and less in terms of its hash power, it sort of starts to take a very long time to successfully complete the attack. So it's an attack that sort of depends on partially on the frequency at which Bitcoin does this sort of readjustment procedure of its difficulty. But it's the case that if you have something like 100, if you have only like 1/100th of the existing Bitcoin hash power in your quantum computer, you can say something like it would take hundreds of weeks, multiple years to actually carry out this attack. So that's actually, I think, a good reason to be less worried about this attack. Is if you need a substantial fraction of the hash power to even start to carry out this attack in less than multiple years, then that would be a good way to put a damper on this attack. And certainly, if you made it the case that the hash algorithm was harder for quantum computers to complete, that could drastically increase the amount of time it would take to successfully complete this attack. And it would be a big sort of disincentive to possible attackers who are thinking about doing it this way.
Yeah, I wonder about like shorter block time, like other ways to kind of punish the. But then I guess the issue there is
absolutely that. I mean, I think I was going to say it. So you can make the complexity of evaluating a hash take longer, and the other side of that is you can make the block time shorter. Now, the block time shorter, probably, I think that would face controversy of its own. I think that there are blockchains, for example, that in fact use proof of work, like Litecoin, I think, is an example that uses shorter block times, and that would be another way of making it harder for these quantum computers to carry out the sufficient number of hashes in the allotted time. So that would be probably another great way. But again, to sort of make a more general statement, right? There are a variety of mitigations to all sorts of these attacks, but the sort of difficulty on a fundamental level that all of these mitigations face is that, the Bitcoin ecosystem has the parameters that it currently has, and the ecosystem is full of community members who have chosen to be in this ecosystem on the basis of the parameters that were chosen, right? So there's sort of like an inherent ossification of, I think, people rightly don't expect the parameters to change. Like getting back to the question of sort of stability, people have chosen Bitcoin because they think that Bitcoin's choices have been sound choices. And if we start to say, okay, we're going to have to change those choices in order to mitigate things, then that is something that, that some people will probably take objection to, particularly if it's the type of change that benefits some people over others. So that's it. I think that's an inherent problem. Maybe it's an inherent problem that goes beyond Bitcoin. It goes to all sort of systems, and the question of ossification and centralization of power and coordination between groups of people converging on shared norms. But I think that's sort of the challenge we face is we have to find a way that will keep us secure going forward, but also is not too much of a change from the properties that we have and like that we already know that we all feel confident in.
What about like Bitcoin layer twos and other types of technologies that inherit Bitcoin security? I don't even really know much about how that actually works. Presumably it's built into some sort of Bitcoin scripting or something of that nature, but what do they have to worry as much?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great question. And I think that's a question that goes to this exact problem of deciding, I think there's a debate that is maybe to some extent currently ongoing about certain Bitcoin opcodes, certain ways that the Bitcoin transaction validation mechanism works. About, do we want this sort of concatenation opcode to be present? That, by the way, is something that would also have an impact on these post-quantum signature schemes. That is sort of a mitigation to the Shor's algorithm that we were mentioning it sort of in the first half. But so, people have these debates, and the thing is, okay, we could have Bitcoin L2s, and I'm someone who's sort of very personally interested in sort of more complex things and smart contracts that can happen on blockchains. That's something I'm interested in. But at the same time, for a long time in Bitcoin, it hasn't been possible to do that sort of thing. And maybe I think there's a valid concern that the more changes are made, the more sort of congestion could come to the Bitcoin blockchain on the due to more people entering the ecosystem that have different desires than the people who are already there. But so, I mean, to speak to the risk that these attacks pose to potential Bitcoin L2s, I think the risks are the same to L2s as they are to the L1. Basically, if we're talking about the Grover attack, these are problems with the consensus mechanism, right? There's a possibility that just as a Bitcoin could be double spent using this sort of malicious attack, it's also possible that an L2 transaction could be reverted due to this kind of attack. It's certainly a possibility. And it's also the case that, if we're not talking about this sort of more malicious attack, but the more sort of, peaceful version where it's sort of the corrupting influence of these Grover miners and their tendency to centralize. I think that, if you are concerned about centralization from the perspective of the Bitcoin L1, you should also probably be concerned about centralization from the perspective of the Bitcoin L2, because it sort of runs into the same problems, right? People are worried when it comes to centralization of a single entity being able to unilaterally block transactions. And if they can block transactions on the L1, then they can probably block transactions on the L2, because L2, I think, it sort of fundamentally ties back to the L1 for its security and its transaction validation, or not its transaction validation, but its transaction finalization. So certainly, I think it's just as much a risk for Bitcoin L2s. And if you're concerned about how the future might go for Bitcoin L2s, it's probably just as important to be worried about quantum risks like this, as in the other case.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I guess my intuition here is, I feel like, and again, the security models between a layer 1 and a layer 2 is not my specialty, I would say. But from what I understand, there's a lot of, you could call like crutches for layer 2s that are maybe cheating in one way or the other and providing handicapped version of it, right? Where I think today, if a quantum, like, those layer 2s would probably be okay. Like they would end up having, like, I don't know if they're fully reliant on Bitcoin security in a genuine way, but theoretically, by the time those attacks become executable, maybe the layer 2s will have that genuine kind of relationship. And again, I could be misspeaking and could be proven totally wrong about that. But that's just, I feel like in practice, in theory, they're just as big of a target. In practice, I feel like they have more mitigation mechanisms that they can turn to than the Bitcoin blockchain itself. This is velocity of change, and we're interested in kind of taking educated guesses or bets about the future, understanding that we'll probably be completely wrong. I'm really curious to know what you feel most confident in terms of, like, it can be a little bit of a tangent. It doesn't have to be exactly what we're talking about, but in this general vicinity, do you have any predictions that you would like to put on the record? Again, we're expecting people to be wrong here.
Yeah. I mean, like, I don't think part of the issue is that I think any like one concrete like prediction I have, probably would have like less than a 10% chance of actually coming through, because there's just so many different
10%. I would say my predictions, I'm aiming for like 1 basis point, I would say, of accuracy. Yeah.
I mean, so like there's so many things that could change. I mean, like one thing that we haven't really talked about at all in this episode, because I think we've been focusing on these sort of attacks, but there are other ways that quantum technology could actually be used to sort of help the cryptocurrency space or the blockchain space. I think one sort of fascinating point of research is this sort of concept of quantum money, right? The idea that you could actually use quantum information in a way that doesn't actually make you have to have contact with any kind of blockchain at all. It's just sort of the double spending is sort of fundamentally built into the quantum information, which is the sort of fascinating possibility. And so there's maybe I think there's one possibility that, okay, maybe in like 20, 30, 40 years, maybe Bitcoin and things like it don't matter at all, because quantum money just if quantum money becomes possible, then maybe it's so much better to use that sort of thing than a traditional cryptocurrency. So maybe that's one possibility. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe everything that we've said in this episode is just totally not a concern, because something will totally change and make it and make the technology go in a different direction. There's also ways that there's things related to applications of quantum information and consensus and sort of communication and secure communication that could also sort of change how different nodes in a blockchain talk to each other, or how they securely communicate, or how they like come to decisions about whether other nodes are behaving honestly or not. So I think there's a number of a number of possibilities about sort of vetting the honesty of blockchain participants in that way. So I guess that's all to say that quantum computing technology is not necessarily all bad. There's lots of things that could change. It's just that we have to be aware that if things change with that, how does that affect our decisions today? Like, how do we expect those changes to be integrated with what we have today? And how is that going to make our decisions to either, take, some crypto asset and do something with it? How is it going to affect what we can do in the future?
Wow. Yeah. That's very, very, very good outlook. I wish we had time to go into the quantum money of the, in this episode. It's so interesting. What do you have a sense of like timelines on things? Like, I know this is one of the most contentious parts of quantum, but any sense of timing?
Certainly. I mean, it's very hard to predict because it's sort of fundamentally an engineering problem. I think I've seen some forecasts that put the development of the kind of quantum computer that would be possible to do the sort of Shor attack that we were discussing. They sort of put that maybe in like the 2030s or maybe the 2040s. I've seen those put forward as predictions. Although as you mentioned, right, there was people continue to make progress, right? I think the key factor there is how well they can get these fundamental building blocks of the quantum computer, the qubits. How accurate can they be made? How precise can they be made? They need to function without errors in order to make a sort of large scale quantum computer. So people are talking about developing that sort of thing, and I'm sure technology will continue to move forward. I think even beyond that, I think it's probably relevant for the sort of more Grover attack part. I think I discussed that it makes a lot more sense to carry out those sort of attacks with lots of quantum computers all working in parallel. So it sort of gets into the question of, okay, well, will quantum computers ever be mass produced, like in the same way that classical computers today have been mass produced? Are they going to be subject to things like, Moore's law? Moore's law was this property of classical computers that it continued to get faster and faster. They sort of doubled in speed every 2 years or so for several decades. Is a similar phenomenon going to happen for quantum computers, where they they continue to get more effective as engineers get better and better at building them? These seem like strong possibilities to me, but I think I think probably there could also be sort of counter cases against them that sort of get into the weeds of the engineering and point out what the most difficult problems are. So I think I personally have a lot of uncertainty about all that, because I consider myself more of a theoretician. I don't know too much about the engineering of these systems beyond what I read from the reports that the engineers make on them. But I think there's a wide possibility of how this technology can develop, and the scale of the effort that society will put into developing them is maybe an important factor there. So to like everything else today, it sort of depends.
Yeah, it depends is the best answer I think we'll probably be able to get here on this episode. Well, I think lastly, we're of course going to link your work, your website, your YouTube, so people can find you. Is there anything else that you would like people listening to know about, your work, or anything that you would like to share?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I left academia and now I blog, right? So I blog on the Quantum Milkman is the name of my blog.
And your YouTube is amazing too. I watched you code for quite a while, actually. Yeah, it was pretty impressive. Bolton, thank you so much for your time. This was absolutely enlightening for me. I hope I didn't drag you too down into the naive parts of quantum, but hopefully we can shoot another one at some point in time. And have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, totally. You too. Thanks so much for having me.
That's it for this episode. If you want to learn more about Bolton's work, I highly recommend checking out his Substack, The Quantum Milkman. And if you're interested in getting involved in quantum, you should check out quantumpunks.org. It's a niche community of folks that are interested in furthering the innovation around quantum computing. To join the conversation, leave a comment, drop a review, or follow me on X. And if you like what we're doing, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in.